Call this reorganization meeting of the Board of Education to order. Public notice of this meeting pursuant to the Open Public Meetings Act has been given by the Board Secretary in the following manner. A posting written notice of the official school bulletin board at the Administration Building on December 17, 2019. Transmitted notice to the Courier Post and the Philadelphia Inquirer on December 17, 2019. Transmitted notice to the Clerk of Cherry Hill Township on December 17, 2019. Pursuant to the Open Public Meetings Act, the Board will meet in open session for its regularly scheduled organization meeting. Please rise for the flag salute.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
We'll now have Mr. Green do the swearing in of our new board candidates. I'd like to join Mr. Green at the podium, please.
Okay, there are two oaths that we're going to administer, so repeat after me. I will go slowly. I state your name. Do solemnly swear that I will support the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the State of New Jersey, and that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same and to the governments established in the United States and this state under the authority of the people. So help me God. I state your name. Do solemnly swear that I possess the qualifications prescribed by law for the office of member of the Cherry Hill Board of Education. I am not disqualified as a voter pursuant to RS 19:4-1. Am not disqualified due to conviction of a crime or offense listed in NJSA 18A:12-1, and that I will faithfully, impartially, and justly perform all the duties of that office according to the best of my ability. So help me God. Congratulations.
Right, so we will have our first official roll call with our new board. Mrs. Arroyo.
Here.
Ms. Friedel. Mr. Goodwin.
Here.
Mrs. Matlack.
Here.
Mrs. Neary.
Here.
Mr. Avadia. Mrs. Seidel.
Here.
Mrs. Schultz.
Here.
Mrs. Tong.
Here.
I will now open the floor for nominations for Board of Education President. Mrs. Matlack.
Eric Goodwin. Eric has served. And understand the challenges and the learning curve needed to do the job well. Eric has stepped up to all of those challenges and has led the board with grace, dignity, and respect. He has respect for each of us, his colleagues. He has respect for our administration and the collaborative working relationship we share with our administration. And he shows respect for our staff, our community, and most of all, our students. So for these reasons, I nominate Eric Goodwin for president.
Are there any other nominations?
Yeah, I will nominate Adele for president.
Any other nominations? All right, I will close the floor on nominations for president. We will start with Mr. Goodwin, and we will take a roll call vote. This is a vote for Mr. Goodwin for board president. Mrs. Arroyo? Ms. Friedel? Mr. Goodwin?
Yes.
Mrs. Matlack? Mrs. Neary? Mrs. Seidel?
No.
Mrs. Schultz? Mrs. Tong? Yes.
Oh, no.
All right, we will next take a vote for Mrs. Seidel. Mrs. Arroyo?
Yes.
Ms. Friedel? Mr. Goodwin?
Yes.
Mrs. Matlack? Mrs. Neary? Mrs. Seidel?
Yes.
Mrs. Schultz? Mrs. Tong?
Yes.
Congratulations, Mrs. Seidel.
Thank you.
So I will let you take over the meeting.
Oh, okay.
For nominations for
Okay.
vice president.
Now we would like to open the floor for nominations for vice president of the board. Mrs. Matlack.
Her leadership skills became evident when she took over as chair of B&F recently. She asked the tough questions, oftentimes thinking outside the box. Her focus as committee chair was to guide us, her fellow board members, to make the best decision for all the children in Cherry Hill, while understanding that there's a need for fiscal responsibility. I think Ruth's leadership, I think Ruth's leadership qualities will complement Lisa's skills that she brings to the table, and I think they would make a good leadership team. So for those reasons, I nominate Ruth Schultz for vice president.
Thank you, Mrs. Matlack. Any other nominations for vice president at this time? Mrs. Tong? Okay, so I'll turn it over to Ms. Sugars for the vote.
Okay, so the first vote is for Mrs. Schultz. Mrs. Arroyo? Ms. Friedel? Mr. Goodwin?
Yes.
Mrs. Matlack? Yes. Mrs. Neary? Mrs. Seidel?
Yes.
Mrs. Schultz? Mrs. Tong? Tie vote. We need a majority. Okay, so next, we will do a roll call vote for Mrs. Neary. Mrs. Araya.
Yes.
Mrs. Friedel. Mr. Goodwin.
Yeah, no.
Mrs. Matlack. Mrs. Neary. Mrs. Seidel.
No.
Mrs. Schultz. Mrs. Tong.
Yes.
We have a tie vote.
Yeah, unless someone wants to change the vote, I mean, we certainly should take at least one more vote. What will happen is if the board is unable to reach a decision tonight, the county superintendent will actually appoint, because tonight is the only occasion on which the board can appoint its president and vice president. So you either reach a majority tonight by someone changing a vote eventually, or at some point we declare it a tie and let the county superintendent make the pick.
Okay.
So I would recommend going through the two names again.
Are we able to ask them to sort of talk a little bit about what they'll bring to the table?
We start with Mrs. Schultz.
So, I guess I'll make a brief statement in regards to the vice president position. First, to Ms. Neary, I think either myself or Ms. Neary would do a great job in the role, so kudos to Mrs. Neary as well. So I'd like to say that. But I think over the past 3 years as being a member of the board, I have made sure that every decision I've made has been for the good of all students. We've had a lot of difficult conversations in the boardroom around exec table. We've had to overcome the failure of the bond, regrouping from that. Served on a lot of committees, a lot of ad hoc committees to kind of push the district forward. For those of you who know me on the board, I have always made sure to, like Mrs. Carroll said, ask the difficult questions to make sure that we are moving things forward for the good of our students and our district. That's kind of why I re-ran for the board. For me, it is about moving forward for the good of our district, our students, our administrators, our community. So that's really what my platform was about. Why I'm here is really kind of what I am hoping to accomplish in the next 2 years. But you know, I'd also congratulations to Ms. Neary, because I also think, you know, you are also would be a wonderful person in the position as well.
Okay, so thank you. Thank you, Ruth. I agree, not prepared to make a statement tonight, but I would say that going forward, I think it's good to see change in leadership. I think it's also good to connect from both sides, and I think it's great representation for moving forward and change. I think it's important. I think it's important for everyone to come together. I think it's a good direction. Again, I'm comfortable with however the board decides to move forward, regardless. But I think certainly both on this board and outside of this board, I think I can very well represent the kids and the community going forward. But again, I leave it to the board. Regardless of what happens, we move forward and we have a job to do. Thank you.
Any discussion from any of the other board members before we take another vote?
Yes, I'd like to weigh in. I have to say I am disappointed. I definitely was looking forward for another term as president. However, I do believe that we are definitely in capable hands with Mrs. Seidel as president. And as far as Mrs. Schultz, I have to say that over the last 3 years, the work she's done on BNF, as well as the work she's done in terms of taking on tough issues, has been phenomenal. I have to say that I think she's very thoughtful, very meticulous in her ideas and how she presents her ideas, as well as always having the thoughts and needs of the children being first. And I believe that she would be an excellent choice as the board vice president. I also have a lot of respect for Mrs. Neary. I'm not gonna, from the work I've had over the last year, I really believe she has great qualifications and everything. But I really do think that Mrs. Schultz, with the years of experience and the kind of in the trenches kind of work that she's done, I think really qualifies her uniquely to really step up to the plate in terms of board vice president. So that's why I want to throw my support behind her.
Anyone else? Mrs. Friedel?
I think over the past year, that when I come to live stream, and one of the things that I see with that she asks questions that are relevant to our students. Questions about how it's going to affect achievement, how it's going to look at how our board decisions are going to all of the students in positive ways. And forward as a district, and those are the types of Schultz, I will say, so it's not to take away from the work Schultz has done over the
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, I think I would just like to add one thing. I think we should consider ourselves very fortunate that we have two fantastic candidates that are eligible for the position. For me personally, and I've said this to many of you over my time on the board, being a Board of Ed member has a very long learning curve. Your first term is a lot of learning on the fly, and I do believe there is some value in leadership having that experience. There's a lot of stuff that we deal with on a day-to-day basis that goes back years, and so for me, I think that there's definitely value in that. But again, most importantly, I think it's great that we're having this discussion and that we have multiple nominations. There have been many times when we haven't had that, so that's a good thing. So with that, I guess I will turn it back over to Mrs. Sugars for a second vote.
All right, we will start with Mrs. Schultz. Mrs. Arroyo. I'm sorry, Arroyo. I'm sorry. Mrs. Arroyo.
No.
Mrs. Friedel.
No.
Mr. Goodwin.
Yes.
Mrs. Matlack.
Yes.
Mrs. Neary. Mrs. Seidel.
Yes.
Mrs. Schultz.
Yes.
Mrs. Tong. All right, we now have another roll call for Mrs. Neary. Mrs. Arroyo. Okay.
Yes.
Mrs. Arroyo. Mrs. Friedel. Mr. Goodwin.
No.
Mrs. Matlack. Mrs. Neary. Mrs. Seidel,
No.
Mrs. Schultz, Mrs. Tong.
Yes.
So it's a tie again, correct?
Tie again, yes.
So our options are continued discussion and another vote, or toss it to the county superintendent to appoint. Okay. So I guess I'll look to fellow board members. Do you want to continue discussion? I would prefer to do it that way, but I'm one voice. Can I ask a question? If this were to go to the county superintendent, if we have further discussion and don't move forward, what criteria does the county superintendent use to make the decision?
We frankly don't know because there are no legal parameters or guidance. It's within the county superintendent's discretion. I presume the county superintendent will ask how much experience the two members have, but beyond that, we really don't know what the county superintendent will look at.
Thank you. So for me, that's a concern. So I mean, I would love to see us come to an agreement and not have to go that option. Because as I mentioned, I think we have two good options on the table. But we definitely have a young board, as you mentioned, Mrs. Matlack, and we have some brand spanking new members who, if the county superintendent were to appoint, for example, as vice president, I think that would make their learning curve that much more difficult. Being a new board member and having a leadership position on the board. So I certainly don't want to put them in that position. I know how long my learning curve was when I first joined the board. So I would love for us to come to a decision and not have to go that alternate route.
We would ask the county superintendent to decide between the two nominated individuals. County superintendent is free to appoint any board member as the vice president. I would hope that the county sup would pick one of the two candidates that were nominated. The county superintendent could, as a fallback, for example, say that the past president should become the vice president. I mean, that's a possibility. There's nothing limiting the county superintendent's discretion here, but I would expect and hope that it would be a choice between the two who were nominated.
So I guess the next part of the discussion, is there anybody who is in a position where they could be swayed to change their vote? Again, personally, I don't think sending it to the county superintendent is a great option. But I'd like to hear from everybody else. We obviously need to come to a decision one way or the other, and we could keep going round and round and voting. I don't know that that makes any sense if nobody is going to change their mind. Again, personally, I think we're fortunate to have two great choices. I don't know that we will have those great choices, or one of those great choices will be chosen if we go to the county superintendent, and that, that's my worry as a board, to have somebody appointed for us versus us as a board being able to make a decision doesn't sit well with me. So that's why I'm hesitant to say, okay, nobody's going to sort of move on this. Let's just send it to the county superintendent. Just my 2 cents. I don't know if anybody else would like to further comment. Well, we can agree to disagree. I definitely did not intend to insult. So if you are offended, I apologize. But I will disagree that experience doesn't matter in the leadership role. From my experience, it does. I wouldn't have been ready for a leadership role in my first term. And again, that's my personal experience, I'm not saying it's yours. I can only use my experience and my journey to guide my decision. So again, I'm not in favor of sending it to the county superintendent. So but I also, I hate that this is so divided like this. Personally, that's what I'm most uncomfortable about. So any one of us has the ability to do something about that in the next round of this vote. But if that, I don't really know how to say what I'm trying to say, but is that what everybody wants? Is everybody, I mean, it sounds like, Rosie, you definitely are in favor of it going to the county superintendent. You would be okay with that. You would support that.
I'm in favor of nominating and approving.
Right, but if we continue with a tied vote, like I personally would rather sit here for a while and keep discussing until somebody feels comfortable voting a different way. But if that's never going to happen, then we have to sort of decide where we're going to go and move on. and I know what I'm willing to do, but again, I'm one person of the people on this board. All right, so we should vote one more time. Is everybody in favor of doing that? Okay.
Start with Mrs. Schultz. Mrs. Arroyo.
No.
Ms. Friedel. Mr. Goodwin.
Yes.
Mrs. Matlack. Mrs. Neary. Mrs. Seidel.
Yes.
Mrs. Schultz. Mrs. Tong.
No.
Right, now, Mrs. Neary, Ms. Arroyo,
Yes.
Ms. Friedel, Mr. Goodwin,
No.
Mrs. Matlack, Mrs. Neary, Mrs. Seidel,
I'm going to vote yes, guys, because I don't want to go around and around on this. So I'm going to be a yes vote.
Mrs. Schultz, Mrs. Tong.
Yes.
Okay. Congratulations, Mrs. Neary. Okay, we're going to move on to presidential appointments. Mrs. Seidel.
Okay, let me find them.
What's,
One second, please.
Carol?
Carol for Camden County School Board Association. Okay, and
And I thought that was you.
this is me. Okay.
We get that.
Okay, sorry about that. Just conferring. So we have two presidential appointments to make. The first is our district representative to the New Jersey School Boards Association. And we would like to appoint that role to Ruth, if that is something that she would like to accept. Oh. I'm sorry. I apologize. Let me start over again. So for the Camden County School Board Association Executive Committee appointment, I would like to offer that appointment to Mrs. Matlack, if she is willing to serve on that committee as that appointment. Right. How long have you been doing that role?
Just a currently.
Okay, thank you.
Do all three appointments and then take the vote.
Yes. So I did this one, Camden. And who's currently the district? That was Jane. Okay. Okay, thank you. So our next appointment is the spot that opened with Ms. Scarpolino's departure from the board. That's the district representative to the New Jersey School Board Association. And for that is the appointment that I would like to ask Ms. Schultz to take on, if willing. Okay. And the third and final presidential appointment is the district representative to the Camden County Educational Services Commission. That is an appointment that I have served on for the past several years. But now that I will be serving as president, I think it would be only right to ask someone else to step into that role. And I would like to see if Mr. Goodwin would like to take over that role for me. Okay. Thank you very much. Can I have a second, please, for those appointments? Ms. Schultz.
Mrs. Arroyo? Mrs. Friedel? Mr. Goodwin?
Yes.
Mrs. Matlack? Mrs. Neary? Mrs. Seidel?
Yes.
Mrs. Schultz? Mrs. Tong?
Yes.
Okay. Next up on our agenda would be an approval of reaffirmation of policies, actions, rules, and regulations, specifically the Code of Ethics.
Mrs. Seidel, if you'd like, we could just move that whole section. We could do the Code of Ethics, the paper, and the advertisements. We could do one motion and 1 second, and then our agenda would be done, other than public comment.
I'm all for that.
Okay. So if we could have a motion for those 3 items?
Mrs. Matlack.
And a second?
Mrs. Schultz.
Mrs. Arroyo? Mrs. Friedel? Mr. Goodwin?
Yes.
Mrs. Matlack? Mrs. Neary? Mrs. Seidel?
Yes.
Mrs. Schultz? Mrs. Tong?
Yes.
Okay. So now we are going to open the floor for public comment. If you would like to make a comment now, please speak into the microphone and clearly state your name and address. Each speaker will be given a maximum of 3 minutes to speak. The timer on the screen behind me will indicate the amount of time you have remaining. Any public comment?
Pat McCargo, 991 Kingston Drive in Cherry Hill. I wanted to first congratulate the new board members, and I would also like to thank Mr. Goodwin for his leadership during his tenure and under very difficult times. And I would say this to the board, especially the new board members: we are one community. I don't care who backed you. You now have an obligation to represent every citizen in this community, whether they voted for you or not. And I can tell you this: I'll be here, I'll be watching. If I'm not here, you better believe I'll be watching online. And there's a message that we need to send to our kids that we're better than what was shown this last election. In all my years in Cherry Hill, never have I seen anything so nasty. And I wasn't here when you said goodbye or so long to Corinne Elmore Stratton, but I would also like to thank her for her service. And she went through fire and brimstone. And to Mrs. Schultz, I also would like to thank you for your service as board vice president. And Mrs. Seidel, I wish you well, and I hope you'll be able to pull the board together so that you all work together for the good of every citizen in this community. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. McCargo.
Good evening, Madam Chair, board members, Councilwoman Wardlow Hurley from the great historic community on the Borough of Lawnside. I bring you greetings from our mayor, our council members, our school board president, Sabrina Forrest, and our superintendent, Dr. Ron Johnson. It's a new day in Cherry Hill like it is all across the state. I just want to congratulate those newly elected board members. This is the first step in your political process. Just remember, like Ms. McCargo said, it is one unity. You have a awesome, awesome new mayor who's going to do great things. So it is with greatness that I say congratulations, and we're your sister neighborhood. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other speakers?
Jen Nadio, 224 North Madison Avenue. Just want to welcome everyone to the new school board year and congratulate all of the new and incoming board members. As many of you know, I am still the president of the Special Ed PTA, and it is important that all of you constantly ask the question, what about all of our students? I was here last night, and there were some new things that are happening at CNI, and the questions were constantly asked by me afterwards. What are we doing for our nonverbal students? What are we doing for our students with special needs? And so when you're up here, I hope all of you are asking the same question because it's really important. But I wish you all well, and I hope we have a really good year, a couple of years. And thank you so much for your service.
Thank you, Mrs. Nadio. Anyone else? Okay, if not, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Goodwin, who would like to make a brief statement.
I just wanted to take this opportunity to say that this last year serving as board president was definitely an honor for me, and I really enjoyed that opportunity, and definitely enjoyed the opportunity to serve the community. And I am disappointed that I'm not going to be serving a second term. However, I am 100% behind Mrs. Seidel, 100% behind Mrs. Neary, and 100% behind the children of Cherry Hill. We, as a board, I hope we can be totally unified in our one desire to make sure that we have the best district for our children, for our staff, and for our community that we can be proud of. And I just want to throw my support 100% behind the new leadership team, and as well as just saying that I was truly honored to be able to serve in that leadership capacity.
Okay. And with that, could I have a motion to adjourn? Mrs. Neary. And can I have a second? Mrs. Matlack. Okay. Again, congratulations to our new board members, Mrs. Arroyo, Ms. Friedel, and Mr. Schultz. And thank you, everybody, and have a great night.